Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are back after a hiatus for another space. The space will be centered around the, let's be honest about it, the debacle in Syria. As you might have felt on my tone, since roughly the 27th of November until now, it went from resignation to now literally Schadenfreude, because that's what's happening in Syria, and a lot of people are discovering that you do not make deals with your enemy without having something that you can exchange with them. Second part of the space will be centered around what's going on in Ukraine, especially in Donbass, with triangulation Kurakovo, Velika Novosilka, and Pokrovsk. As you might have seen the post this morning over the Pokrovsk battle, which, as I actually spoke about in late September, early October, the first signs would be a large encroachment around Pokrovsk within 5 to 7 kilometers of it. On the side of Mirnograd, Promin, and the straight line from the E50 and 30, Russians are way closer than 5 kilometers. Simply there, it was way too limited as a frontal approach. So that seems to have been happening. And finally, we will speak about 2025, what it reserves, given a flurry of statements from a lot of people, including Narishkin, who said that Russia was coming close to the success in its goals for the SMO. In a certain sense, it's true, and I'm going to explain you why. Although I've already made I think, post or at least a thread about it, and that's pretty simple. If you have seen my replies today, you would know. And the Ukrainians themselves are indeed pointing out what exactly that means. And of course, it is an encroachment into the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which would then create the exact contrary to what the Ukrainians wanted to do with the Kursk incursion. We will have time to shit on that in about half an hour, hopefully. But generally speaking, yes, now those who are fighting this war on the Ukrainian side are understanding that by giving the Russians the time to develop their offensive in southern Donetsk Oblast, the front line, the complete front line has been widened so much for the troops who are still lacking in number on the Ukrainian side, which of course allows the Russians to use their favorite tactic, which is a salami tactic, slowly cutting areas of offense and then strangulating the areas along the potential and capability of the troops employed, up to the point when we have what happened right now in Pokrovsk, where suddenly, after a hiatus of advance of roughly 10 days, where the advances around the Pokrovsk area were between 5 and 6 kilometers a day, but all over the place. Now we had at once 40 kilometers in one day, as declared by Deep State, because the reality is that this happened in a more linear way. But once again, given the fact that most of these maps are based on quote-unquote geolocations, you sometimes see these advances at once, like it happened with the battlefield shaping route Ugledar, before they completely broke through Zotaniva and to the east of Velika Novosilka. Now we will start from the beginning, and that is with Syria. For a lot of people, Syria is dear. To me, honestly, I had lost a little bit of interest after 2022. I will explain why. But most importantly, the Syrian story is linked to the Assad family, but especially with Bashar. I made the joke today. I said Bashar was given a BlackBerry in the world of iPhone or Apple, which meant that everything when he had it in 1999 seemed perfectly fit. Everybody was going out of a Cold War period where Syria actually had managed to play the game pretty nicely and had obtained through the Taif agreements a expanse within the Lebanese Republic, which meant that a lot of the troubles that will befall Syria after 2005, including by the repatriation of between 400,000 and 500,000 Syrian workers, which were an easy way for the Syrian leadership both to control the Lebanese economy and policies, but also to bring money home. So there was a kind of social program, if you want, occupation social program or cooperation, whatever you want to call it, but let's call it an occupation. Well, after Bashar took over, a couple of things happened. First of those things, was 9/11. And the second of those things was the fact that the foreign Western policy, especially the French one, when it came to Lebanon, started to have a view on, for some reason, and this is a typically Chirac position, to be honest, to discharge Lebanon from Syria and take over that part in some kind of enlightened formula. The problem with the French initiatives within Lebanon and Syria, and this doesn't mean that we're gonna whitewash the Syrian responsibility on how Lebanon went, follows also the retreat of the Israeli forces from South Lebanon. Therefore, the whole logic was Israelis are out, now there is no excuse for the Syrians to be there, certainly not for Hezbollah to be there. Of course, the Israelis still hold on Syrian land, the Golan, and on Lebanese land with the Bekaa farms, Sheba farms, Bekaa Valley. Therefore, at no point the Western diplomacy, but especially the French one, had any idea on how to deal with the logic on making Lebanon a kind of neutral ground instead of turning Lebanon against Syria. What happened between 2000, so the Israelis get the fuck out, Hezbollah tries to get as much clout from this liberation because it was so. And then, of course, the Westerners thinking with the exact same way as we are thinking today of HTS over Hezbollah, said that Lebanon cannot be entrusted in the hands of terrorists. And you had an escalation of this campaign, which led to Hariri being assassinated, which was the prime minister. Initially, Hariri was in good terms with Bashar. Then things changed, especially with the introduction of some special situations given by the French diplomacy, European diplomacy. But in 2004, you had a US act, which was Syrian Accountability and Independence of Lebanon Act, something like that. I'll find the exact terminology. But basically, a series of sanctions and of pressure was put from the US in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, and therefore the logic of the problem of terrorism is Arab autocracy in the region. Therefore, there's autocracy, you're going to have terrorists because they cannot express themselves within the country. They are going to be, in some way, guns to wire, whatever. The French, on the other side, as I said, for them it was purely a personal affair between Chirac and Assad, and then after Chirac went, it was a follow-up of that policy by, unfortunately, the small midget. And therefore, we got the situation post 2005. 2005 is the first dramatic act. Harry is killed. You got the Cedar Revolution. Within a couple of weeks, the Syrians agreed to pull out the troops. They had about 30,000 troops within Lebanon. And of course, after the troops went the migrant workers. This will impact profoundly the Syrian economy, because the transfer of people from Syria to Lebanon will be beyond halved. I think instead of having 400,000 or 500,000 people per year, somewhere between 100 to 120,000 will return at some point in a completely different scenario. That's the first big issue for Syria. On top of it, I would like you guys to go and check for the Syrian infrastructure programs. A lot of them, you should go and check for thermal power plants. A lot of them are from the early 90s to late 90s. So Hafez al-Assad, to some degree, tried to alleviate the problem of the fragility of the whole Syrian system after the Hama massacre in '82 by trying to get more of the population involved into this nation building program. And it was almost everything: roads, CPPs, HPPs, TPPs. A couple of dams were finished during the Hafez rule, but literally started being logical when Bashar stepped in. Therefore, as I said, you could think from Bashar's perspective that he had a BlackBerry, which initially was dominating the quote-unquote smartphone paging market, and then slowly was completely phased out roughly around 2011 when the first iPhone got out. And in this case, the iPhone was the Arab Spring. Now, the worsening of the Syrian state in terms of economic power, but also demographic balance, hits the peak somewhere around 2007, 2008. It is made worse by the invasion in 2003 of Iraq, which means that a huge part of its border becomes a completely lawless area with hot pursuit from the Americans within Syrian territory, black ops of the American side killing Sunni collaborators of Al-Qaeda or Iraqi resistance or jihadists, doesn't matter. But basically you have a lot of situational issues there, and that just makes it worse for Damascus to control its east and northeast. There are other problems with northeast of Syria being a hotbed for PKK or Kurdish extremists or revolutionaries. Call it as you wish. Right now, I have nothing against these people, to be honest. At first sight, 2007, 2008, you had a huge change. There is a decision taken after the Americans think that Al-Qaeda is more or less defeated, and the Shia majority in Iraq is taking over security steps. This, of course, is a complete lunacy, but the decision is made to start pressuring Assad for the border. And it's there on between 2007, 2008, 2009 that a lot of the operational rooms and also outfits that would start supplying the rebels from 2011, 12, 13, and 14 will stem. People have already understood or heard about Purple Shovel or Timber Sycamore, all these trashy operations outfits that were set up by the quote-unquote orange team that had started to, pick up people within the Syrian system in order to weaponize them for something else. Then you have also Wesley Clark that says that at some point the decision was made to hit 7 countries 5 years. I would not really trust that, because Wesley Clark is one of those people that I would see hanged for a lot of things, despite the role he had into the situation in Kosovo. But the point is that you cannot benefit from a crime, and that's the problem that we are still having in Kosovo, especially the Serbs. There was no clear cut there. A lot of treachery was used on both sides, and therefore none of the sides is ready to cut it clean and try to find a decision. And right now, what's going on in Kosovo is hanging by a thread of military might of the basically NATO forces that are currently manning Camp Bonesteel, and also the fact that Serbia is completely surrounded by NATO members. But in the case of Syria, from 2007, 8, 9 until the Arab Spring situation, 2010 actually, because that's when it really started in Tunisia, the situation, people spoke about drought, people spoke about mismanagement, people spoke about corruption. The Syrian state had been corrupt, will be corrupt, will keep going corrupt, because the balance was such that you had this minority, exactly like in Iraq, but with the roles reversed, where you had this non-Sunni minority relying on Sunni Coptans and Christians to manage the state, whereas the Sunni majority, for one or another reason, was not being allowed to actually take the power. And the whole logic of this Alawi control over the Syrian state, for good or bad or worse, as I said, was a systematic problem and a systemic problem of how Syria would work. Because for a smaller group, you needed to have multiple allegiance ploys, which would allow you to keep going and manage the country. And the 82 massacre in Hama was, in a certain sense, a complete show on exactly what was going to happen if a alternative would pop out. And in a certain sense, it's exactly what happened in Iran when you had an alternative to the minority Zoroastrian group who was controlling the back then Iranian empire. Yes, that was the term, guys. Well, when it flips, you have a complete reversal, and you get what you are getting right now, which is a majority rule, or at least a winner's justice on the minorities, because they let themselves unprotected, they let themselves caught unprotected. So 2011, you have the first issues which show that the system that Hafez had put in place wasn't working, and the decay caused partially by the end of the Cold War, the non-competitive production and portfolio that Syria had back then, the cut off from the Lebanese funding as well. But most importantly, the fact that the war in Iraq started to give an extra oomph of importance to the eastern border, and extra oomph of money being paid by funding coming from the Gulf for the jihadists, but also funding coming from the Americas to actually not support the jihadists, created, as I said, all this network and prepared the Syrian Republic to the perfect time bomb that we saw from 2012 until its downfall a few days ago. Now, fast forward 2015, Russians come. They start a campaign. This campaign is based on addressing the main issues that the Syrians had back then, which is a obsolescence of means when it came to the Air Force and an obsolescence of structure within the Syrian armed forces, which did never go away. If you guys were following the Syrian civil war, the Syrian Arab army was infected by the same issues that the opposition was fighting. It started to delve into warlordism, and even with the Russians coming through, those mistakes were never actually corrected, and that's one of the first issues that the Russians never managed to fix within Syria. Then you had the second step, which is the Russians, when they came, they still had enough people to rely on. So everybody says that Soleimani went to Moscow, convinced the Russians that I'm going to bring you enough foot mobiles, you're going to bring enough boom boom, and we're going to repel these guys. I have a plan. That plan was more or less correct. However, as usually it needed a little bit of tweaking. The initial campaign from the Russian side wasn't that successful, if you might remember. The bombs were falling at the right places, but it didn't go that fast. Especially because the Russians wanted absolutely to protect the air base they had, and by extension the Alawi heartland. This created the situation with the Su-24 shot on Turks, and that decided the Russians to, in a certain manner, to pull the gloves off, and they started a campaign of counterinsurgency, which was more or less bombing the rear areas, including civilians, to be sure that the forces that were drawn from those rear areas could not arrive to the battlefield in good shape. This worked, especially as I said, they had enough foot mobiles and had enough local contacts that would make that pretty easy. So basically, the Russian strategy was pillarized by the Pasdaran having an idea on who to fight first, and Hezbollah covering and actually having the close security detail for the Russian troops as to avoid having people filtering there and having the kind of shit show we had in Afghanistan with green on blue, as it was called. So basically, Taliban moles penetrating the ANA and then shooting high-ranking officers and American soldiers. So this trio worked perfectly between 2015 and 2018. 2018, there was a choice to be made. The choice was made to finish the remnants of Palmyra, clean up the south, and then turn to Idlib. So fast forward, 2020, the Russians actually do exactly what I would thought would happen now, which is pressure the Idlib jihadis to a point where they would be forced to attack in order to press back and try to have a breathing space. In 2020, that's what happened. Jihadis were baited. The Syrians fought back, pushed them back, massacred a whole bunch of them. Turks tried to intervene to stop the advance towards Idlib. It gave the balloon bombing, but not only that. And then Turks fought back with their drone onslaught. A lot of Syrian assets were wasted, but at least at the 6th of March, the fight ending with a de facto Syrian state victory. And, well, you know about the story that happened since 2017 with the green busification, even though it starts with the Aleppo victory. But slowly, the whole point was to fill up the box in Idlib, have them fight with each other. It was a defensible strategy, but it didn't work as we can see right now. It didn't work the way people thought. On top of it, the Turks didn't help with this strategy. As I said, they never kept their part of the deal in 2020. The M4 was never cleared. They left the jihadists to roam free. The ISIS coalition also made it sure that never mind what victory, quote unquote, Assad would achieve, the Russians would achieve, it will be always imperfect because of sanctions, because of the occupation of about 30% of Syrian territory, including oil wells, part of the farmland, but also, most importantly, they would be on the Euphrates, and that was the whole point of this war, which was having access to the borders beyond the Euphrates as to be able to control what and who would enter the territory. And then ISIS was never really eradicated. These guys were living into caves, small actions almost imperceptible, but they were still there. Now, post 2020, it seemed that Assad had won completely the war. South was pacified, North was literally a cage of wolves eating each other. We've seen so many things going on. You remember the OGN guys getting arrested, beaten, and then released. Then some people that were supposed to be ISIS were arrested and killed. Then you had fights between SNA and HTS or whatever those guys were called back then. That resulted into the Turks being extremely vocal against HTS. We had a starvation practiced by the Turks and Assad, but overall, modus vivendi was found more or less. This modus vivendi, which was the biggest issue, apparently went against the pullback of the most virulent proponents of a total victory in Idlib. For instance, one urged general, Mr. Jafari, was pulled back, Chaiko was pulled back, and more amenable people were pushed forward on both sides, Iranians and Russians, in order to make it easier for whatever political agreement there was to be had to succeed. On top of it, slowly, we're going towards 2022. And one thing that happens in most of these cases, the longer a war is fought, the less means you're going to get to fight it if you do not control your own resources. In this case, the Syrians had nothing. They were depending for oil from Iran and from Russia for financing. They had to turn into various traffics, but also extremely cheap production. Sanctions hit them. The Syrian pound literally shrunk and disappeared like it was a joke. And the few things that the Syrians could sell or buy or whatever, basically monopolized in the hands of a few. And on this part is unfortunately a 100% regime issue, and Russia as well. They didn't manage to make Assad understand that things should have been Assad or his system, actually, because I do not think that Assad was able to call all the shots. These systems do not work like that. But those people in power did not manage to actually understand the fact that it was time maybe to put some water in their wine or their arak in this case. And that's what brings us to the situation where the Syrian Arab Republic decided against, I think, the main logic to put aside most of its armed forces simply because it couldn't pay them. So a lot of people say, yeah, war is over, you let people go. But when you hear from some points of view, and on one of those was from the Russian side, which meant that most of the fighting commanders, most of the medium-level commanders, which actually were the ones who fought the war for the Syrian Arab Republic, were simply either shelved or were put into places where actually they were irrelevant anymore. And we went back to a systemic nepotist plundering of what was available in Syria. Now, a lot of people will speak about Captagon and stuff like that. I think that both sides were busy trying to get a way to earn money. And on that aspect, the type of system you're going to build. But once again, this is a product of the stress that Syria was under. As I said, you don't control your resources. You cannot freely buy or sell. A lot of your stuff actually gets impounded, it gets taken away, and on top of it, your borders are really not your borders anymore. Turks control north, the Iraqis and the Americans control your east, and the south is not even under control. A small patch or large patch of the territory is basically American occupied. And then you have the Golan, which is literally a dark matter, a triangle of the Bermudes, where if you see how the war started in 2011, 2012, you can understand that there was a tacit agreement between the quote-unquote jihadist revolutionaries, call them as you wish, and the Israeli forces, because one of the biggest extensions of the quote-unquote revolution initially was around those areas, Dara, Suwaida, and so forth, which was also closer to Damascus, which is logical. So for the Israelis, toppling Assad was almost as important as for the jihadis, as for Erdogan, and as for absolutely anybody who, well, wanted the quote-unquote Nusayris gone from Syria, from the Sham. So, couple of bad decisions on the allies of the Syrian Arab Republic. The Russians start with the Ukrainian operation, and very soon you can see the Russians starting to pick up some goods and reduce their footprint within Syria. I said it right away. The moment you see that you're going to 2023, you should, as Russians, just move the fuck out. Reduce the threat on the regime if you need to, and do a kind of Operation Magistral that happened in Afghanistan, or start speaking to Erdogan. And at some point, it seemed that it would be that way. Multiple Iranian accounts actually use this narrative to justify why nothing was done to save the Syrian Arab Republic by lining up a number of dates. For instance, from April 2023 until very late in 2024, Assad was still rubbing shoulders with the petromonarchies, be that Saudis, the Emiratis, Qataris, and so forth and so on. And at that point, the Iranians also identify threats for the Syrians. They say that 2 months ago there was this and that. I do not buy the Iranian narrative, not that because I don't want to buy it, but if the Iranians were so focused on saving Assad, they would have pulled the man, they would have pulled drones, they would have pulled the missiles. It wouldn't be a too little, too late situation, because at the end of the day, the only few people that came to defend Syria were a couple hundred Iraqi militias. More we didn't have. We didn't saw more drones. We didn't saw more airplanes coming through. We didn't saw more artillery or equipment. And one of the things that we're seeing right now, especially now with the Israeli destruction of Syrian storages, is that at the end of the day, it really seems that the Syrians were dry. They had maybe the equipment, but the munitions that are being shown as captured, I don't know if you remember, guys, 2013, 2014, with a fuck ton of things that were caught from the Syrian army. What we're seeing right now is nothing. Is literally nothing. Yes, the equipment, the vehicles, the tanks, they're important, but you don't have the assets to man them. Logistically, it seems to have been drained absolutely dry. And then you start understanding what some Russian specialists were saying about 2022, 2023, about how the actual token victory was undermining the fighting victory, because the fighting victory never really happened. The other guys never tapped out to say, you know what, we renounce the fight, we get out of this. No, at no point HTS decided to surrender the weapons and in a certain sense, as the Turks wanted, but the both sides in this case, to basically reach an agreement and restart a whole Syrian chapter with HTS getting pardoned and a slight confederalism within Syria, stuff like that. That never happened. And for the Turks, and from the Iranian perspective, this was a stalling tactic. In my opinion, that's not the case. It's just that circumstantially, Syria paid for Ukraine when it comes to the Russian side. And circumstantially, the Russians, finally, they thought they were safe. Was that a right position, a wrong position? It doesn't really matter. Now it's done. But I think at that point, the game played by everybody, including the Turks, seemed pretty much a logical step forward with, as I said, Assad being reaccepted. We had at some point in June and July, Italians wanted to opening the consulate back in Damascus. All this stuff was going on. So nothing was showing up as a potential cataclysmic situation with a all-out attack from HTS. Now, this is a mistake that once you analyze it properly, and this is going to be my first guesstimation of what happened. And in that sense, I would like you guys to, just keep in mind, this is what I think. I don't think I do not know if it's true or not. Let's go back to 2020. 2020, you have a lot of people on Bashar's army who are now on a roll. They are absolutely stomping everybody. It's slow, it's laborious, but it's certain. It's so good that they pressure the rebels to initiate an attack in 2020. It completely turns to a shit show for them. And they are moving up. They've taken Sarakib, they are moving up towards Idlib, and it looks like it's going to be a bloodbath with rebel heads on pikes. Then Turkey intervenes to back them up. It turns also into a shit show because, at some point the Turks themselves cannot hide their intervention to actually stop the Syrians with the Iranians and the Russians from actually getting back the territory. You have Balyoun, you have the backlash from the Turkish armed forces, and you have the ceasefire in March 2020. At that point, I think a lot of, as I said, SAA officers, especially those who are not Alawi, Sunnis, they have their first fallout, especially those officers that were recovered, that were reconciled. That's the worm. The worm is already in the fruit. And they are waiting. If you can see on the loyalist pages for 3 years, post March 2020, they were waiting for a attack to finish off Idlib. And on that aspect, the Turks also made it very possible for that to happen by mistreating the HTS part of Idlib. At some point, Turks were cutting, as I said, fuel supply for them. A big city or big governorate as Idlib was getting 150,000 allegedly liters of car fuel per day, which is, you have to measure itself. There were supposed to be 3 to 4 million people in the whole governorate, and these guys are getting less than 100 milliliter per day. Like, it makes no sense. Um, and therefore, the starvation, in my opinion, instead of serving as a bug breaking tool for HTS, it simply made them hungrier. Whereas the Syrian army, after its victory in 2020, started to get disbanded. In a certain sense, as I said, 2020 was seen as a victory, incomplete, but a victory, which meant that suddenly all the threat for a lot of people within the government areas was starting to recede, and you had some kind of decompression situation, where these people who have been on the brink for 10 years suddenly can breathe easily and get way too casual with the situation, especially as any kind of small attempts by the other side gets bombed to shit by the Russians. And there you have HTS, which is absolutely fucked over by the Turks, is asked to just shut the fuck up and take it, who, instead of doing that, wages an internal war, streamlines completely its affairs within Idlib, takes over the majority of shares within this so-called revolution. And first thing they do is they start talking to those SAAs who are now in no position to benefit from the war or literally fight it and finish it. So they're going to start to reconcile people. They're also going to start to all these people who start thinking, wait a minute, we are Syrians here. Okay, we're fighting other Syrians or whatever, but instead of winning and taking over our country, we are now put on the side while foreigners are negotiating who will get what. And then comes Giuliani saying, see, this is what I told you guys about. You think that Bashar is pro-Syrian, but actually is just a foreign kelp. He's just a foreign dog. And this is who you're fighting for someone who has sold Syria. And Giuliani can pretty much say, look, Turks want to hire us, but we're not letting ourselves vote. So if you want someone who thinks about Syria, I'm there. I'll promise you, if you join forces with me, nothing's going to happen to you. And this job goes hand to hand with trying to get notables in areas that were reconciled, in areas where people were not bussed. If you see what happened, the Fifth Corps within the Syrian army melted away. People gonna say that there were fierce combats, FPVs and shit like that. I do not believe that. The FPV strikes, if you want to fight, are not breaking the Ukrainians, who I think, and Russians as well, but the Russians is a different matter. But Ukrainians probably lose between 20, 30 vehicles of all kinds per day as a minimum. Are they giving up? No. We saw a handful of FPVs making all these people run. Is that true? Is that so simple? No. The reality is that a lot of people first didn't want to fight after 3 to 4 years of relative peace. And then others just probably agreed to let it go. Because it has been 2 years that you were let off by Assad, and then nothing is coming your way. This is the mid-level officer corps in reserve or still acting. Then you got stories by the Russians that the former officer were let go and the new guys had a lot less competence. So you got now less competent officers who don't want to die taking off the hottest areas of the front. And people around those officers, they are also talking to Giuliani, and you suddenly get a completely rotten system, and they got you from the inside from the beginning. After you do that, you go to Recep and you say, listen, I'm going to do this action, and I'm going to do it because I know I'm going to do this, this, and that. Now, the Turks probably think like you're fucked up if you fail. We're not going to rebuild you. But Giuliani, on this part, I think was absolutely sure about his shot. Because, as I said, he had already done the only job that Assad didn't want to do. Assad didn't want to talk with these people. Whatever they want to tell them, it was just give up. You've beaten yourself to this game. But at no point there was any kind of pressure on HTS except from Turkey. But the Turks themselves didn't want to throw HTS to the Russians because it would have meant that the border from which they were actually reaping so many benefits, they had the Russian attentions, they were absolutely on top of their game. The Turks, diplomatically and militarily, since they stopped the Syrians from clearing Idlib, were absolutely dominating the northern of Syria. A lot of people were fearing that the SNA would launch the attack, but the reality was that the Turks didn't care about who would launch the attack ultimately, because they both had the Russians on the phone, given the Russian situation with Ukraine, but they also had a good knowledge on what was going on with Assad, on top of the whole diplomatic game going around with the petromonarchies. So post factum, of course, we can all make this guesswork. But on the spot themselves, the game was pretty well set by Giuliani, that you need to admit that his revolutionary tune, his nationalistic takeover, which he actually played to the T in front of the Western press when he said, oh, we are going to put in place a confessional confederate Syria. And when you're young, you're hot, but when you grow older, you get bullshit. He finally did what he failed to do initially because he thought he had the forces to beat the SAA. But once he understood that from the outside it was impossible, Giuliani put in place, probably aided by other people, the system where he simply overplayed everybody. And the Turks helped him to a point, in a certain sense, by knowing what the aim was, but not trusting him fully. That's why the SNA didn't join the initiative from the get-go. And instead of joining at Aleppo, they first went for Quds and then for the Kurds to establish a buffer. So there would be no communication between the Aleppo Kurds and the SDF areas. So on that aspect, I think the Russians' trust on the Iranian intelligence and on the Syrian intelligence was a disaster. And yes, the trust on the Turks as well was bad. And this is why I think that officers within the Russian contingent in Syria, like Kisel, got way too casual, way too friendly with their Turkish counterparts. And this, of course, is understood given how little threat the Russians started to face after 2021. And I think that was the main issue, is that the Turks eased the game so much for the Russians that the Russians felt that it was going to go into a frozen conflict within 5 to 10 years. At some point, the other side would surrender or join in, and you would have another melted revolution, like it happened in most of these countries, except of course in Libya. But that just wasn't the case, and this flow. Actually, the Russians didn't perceive it in Ukraine. Actually, the Russians understood that in Ukraine it was going to shit. They were smart enough, but in Syria, it clearly shows that the Syrian theater for the Russians slept into a secondary, even a tertiary position. And there is nothing else to say about it. Now, the fault itself of the military operation, on top of the fact that Giuliani made a move, is also, as I said, on the Iranians. If the Iranians knew 2 months in advance, they had more than enough time to bring enough tools to deal with the jihadis. Don't forget, guys, on both sides, we saw very little things done. The Russians were bombing Idlib, were bombing some kind of columns and stuff like that, especially the 2 bombings in Aleppo. But generally speaking, the Iranians were boasting, this UAV, UCAV know-how, and I'm sorry to say, but it's nowhere to be seen for a country with that much potential. And this is, once again, I'm not putting in doubt their know-how. Quite the contrary. I'm asking myself, where was it? In the group, I said that even the 2 first days of this shit show, of course, unbeknownst to me, that a lot of the Syrian forces had just given in. The Iranians could have landed in T4 with enough UAVs, UKs, and would have made it an actual shooting war. Never happened. The small resistance in Hama and the attempt by the Russians to blow Rastan Bridge in order for them to slow down the advance were already outplayed by Giuliani having spoken with people in Salameh and having a completely B plan going all over the Rastan causeway. Giuliani was executing, whereas the SAA, in the best case scenario, was starting to plan a counter move. And we had this discussion about with a follower about the Syrian army being a sand army in the Pollock sense. I do not think so. I do not think that Syrian army in this case was a sand army. I really think that the Syrian army didn't exist anymore. Before Giuliani started the offense, as a cohesive unit, of course, the equipment was there, soldiers nominally were there, and initially we were joking within the group about it's a Kharkov move and this and that, but actually no, in Kharkov the Russians fought, although they were out of tempo, although they had huge major intelligence failures, the same that the Russians had within Syria, but here in Syria you have a excuse that the locals do not tell you the truth. But in Syria, from what we saw, from how people just literally abandoned everything, the fish was rotten from the head, and the body didn't want to swim. Now with the problem that the body is going to get purged. Despite every single nonsense video that was shown the first few days about we're forgiving you and shit like that, we are now seeing videos where you can hear Nusayri's kalb and then a automatic fire sequence with people being dead. We have people getting lynched on the street. We have people getting killed casually. We had people from SNA shooting off wounded Kurdish militias. We have Kurds firing to the population that's come to manifest in Deir ez-Zor. We're gonna have this stuff going on for a while, and given the term that was announced by al-Bashir, which is the new appointed prime minister of the Salvation government, we are going to see this for 2.5 months, because the preliminary end of the this transition period is for the 1st of March 2025. Now the problem with this is that very quickly, I mean, I don't know for the group, but I personally very quickly told them, like, relax, like, you cannot change it. If people have sold out, they have sold out. I wouldn't believe it in the beginning because of what's happening now. Like, I do not think anybody here would say, "Oh, you know what? I'm gonna just drop my weapon and hope that the guy who has sworn to kill me and my family, including the guys who are already buried, is gonna forgive me." And yes, it might sound hyperbolic, but that's exactly what these people said they would do in 2012, 2014, 2016, 17, 19, 20, and even now. So I couldn't fathom Alawis, non Sunnis, saying, "You know what, guys, fine, here's my weapon. Ciao. I'm fading into the fucking light." No. And there was my mistake. And in a certain sense, now they're paying for it. How long is this payback gonna last? Hopefully not long. But even if that payback doesn't last, you have two other problems. First of them, and the golem in the room, is Israel. Israel got out of the situation of the October 2023, and apparently they enabled some kind of Samson option without the nukes, because they hit their stride somewhere around this year in June, with Gaza more or less over, although it kept going, still is going. But they turned the war around by hitting Hezbollah, making it impotent to help Syria, threatening Syria, bringing the troops to the south, preparing forcefully for an invasion. All that material that was brought forth, that initially was thought was going to go to Lebanon, which happened. Post the pager attack, there was a ground operation phase, which led to the Israelis, in my opinion, drawing enough Syrians into this quote-unquote trap, damaging Hezbollah enough, but still not being able to fulfill their options, or so we thought. But now, after trying on the hard door, they went with the softer door, pulled Assad's best troops in the south, allowed a movement from HTS to the north, which took out most of the disparate fighting forces of Assad. Those guys pushed towards Damascus. In Damascus, those groups that for a long while were abetted by Israel somehow sprung back to life and took over Damascus. And once the Syrian Arab state was done, there you go. Israel, in direct line of what happened initially in 2011, 2012, started a push towards Mount Hermon, which allows them to start to sever the connection between Hezbollah and Syria. So the peace deal they made with Hezbollah literally is worthless for Hezbollah. Now the Israelis are going to cut the border or make it almost impossible for anything to go through, on top of the fact that the Syrian Arab state doesn't exist. So they cannot help Hezbollah anyway. And now you have a physical interdiction between both countries and a kinetic interdiction of any kind of relevant stocks of weapons or assets that can be used against Israel in a near or medium term future. So the plan from Israel, if everything was calculated, was so well prepared. And if it's not calculated, it was an opportunistic approach. Then we are here into a complete control of the battle space information-wise. Now we're learning that the Syrians were actually cooperating with Israel in order to reduce the Iranian, I'd say influence, but to reduce the Iranian transit from Syria to Lebanon in benefit of Hezbollah under Russian control, which makes things even not only awkward, but literally shows that there is a self-defeating situation. Because the link that serves between the Mukhabarat, quote unquote, and the Israel intelligence can be used for anything. This nice cooperation initially can become a huge system of controlling way more than, just this channel of contact. It can be used to know exactly where the shit is. And every time, I think at one moment, at one point, the Iranians for sure they knew they had moles everywhere. But they were forced to use the system because there was nothing else. You are here to protect these people, and these people are fucking you in the ass. And the same thing happened to the Russians as well, ultimately. So, in this kind of environment where nothing is true and everything is false, I am amazed that the Syrian state, the way it was designed, resisted 13 years. You can call it cope, you can call it whatever you want. But holy fuck, there are so many intertwined interests going on that at some point I can firmly understand, especially if the Israelis start to leak shit to lower level commanders in favor of Jolani, you can perfectly understand the disgust a lot of these people are gonna have. Like, you're fighting an enemy and you are side to side with your Iranian forces, but you learn that your higher ups are selling them, and you as well, so that Israel doesn't use more force against you. It's literally snitch level. You have this symbiosis of gangsters and police to favor one side and to protect you. Like, it's beyond cinema. And on top of it, the populations that you are trying to defend, as they say, but also control, give up. The Alawis gave up without firing a shot, except the guys who died on the front lines, and there were a lot the last 14 days. But once it was done, everybody literally let them come in. In Latakia, you have people now that are getting shot in the street. Kardahar, same thing. Homs, Hama, it's happening. It's going to continue like that. And this will be even more pregnant because of how the system was working at almost every level. And this is going to happen again under the new management because of the structure of the state. I said initially, and the group can vote to that, I said, I don't care about Assad from the 27th. What was important was the people because of what's going to happen, willingly or not willingly. The core interest of Syria right now is it as a transit spot between Jordan and Turkey, between Iraq and Turkey, and between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. But that's for 5 to 10 years. What's important right now, where you're going to have most of your imports to alleviate the crisis within the country, is going to be the coastline, which is sparsely populated by Sunnis. It's mostly Alawi. And if you want to get control over it, what's going to happen is, in the best case scenario, a massive relocation of the new owners of Syria to the coastline. A lot of people that were high within the Assad system are going to lose their privileges. Was this your house? Was this your wife, your daughter? If they're still there, of course. Well, the dad's going to get hanged or executed on the spot. Mom, doesn't matter what happens. The lady, if she's useful, she's going to end up in Turkey as a whore. And the house and whatever was inside the house is gone for the new boss. Militia head, government minister, maybe Julan himself. And before you talk about me exaggerating stuff, barely. I've seen this happen. I was there in 92 and I was there in 97. It was in Syria, was Albania. It was like that. And it was almost everywhere. Guys robbed at gunpoint, just driving along, trying to flee, stopped, searched. Oh, you got money, you got a passport. Oh, I got something for you too. In the ditch, gone with your whatever car you had, your passport, your Deutschmarks, clothes. Like as I said, I'm having fucking flashbacks and it's very bad. But at the same time, these guys let themselves do. It wasn't some kind of collapse of the state out of the blue. They had the civil war and they just let it happen. Within the population, we're not speaking about the war between factions. I'm saying if the ploy was so deep that once one hand didn't know what the other did and both hands didn't wash their face, that's what's gonna happen. You're gonna have a real proper collapse. And now the only thing that we can hope is that the situation goes so out of control between Israel, Turkey, the Kurds, and the Turks of the HDS that someone intervenes, but that someone's not going to be the Russians. That someone, unfortunately for a lot of people, might well be the Americans. But Uncle Sam is not going to be nice to anyone, except the Turks, of course. Israel is not in this calculus. Israel is going to get away with probably Mount Hermon, and that's it. They're not going to get Damascus. They're not going to get too high, but the whole Montermion, that linchpin of the communication between both sides, in my opinion, is gone for a while, if not forever. And then the guys who are gonna get hammered the most, well, Kurds, um, maybe the HTS if they step out of line, and some of the militias that the Turks are going to basically allow to get slaughtered, because anything else doesn't really matter as it stands. Everything else is just shit. So, yeah, once again, we are going to get into this situation where the Americans, through their sheer power, most the economy actually, because the military might there is not gonna be used as hard as it should be, but economically speaking, the Americans are just going to choke everybody, starting by the Turks, by the way. So, yeah, it's bleak. I told you guys that it was going to be depressing. I'm not. I've never been someone who's going to lie to you or mince my words, but the situation as it stands right now, unless someone starts talking to, as I said, the Turks and the Russians, and that someone is the HTS for support, um, we're not going to have any kind of happy ending for a while. And as I said, given the length of the transition period from um, the Salvation government, it's 2 months and a half, guys. I just need to tell you that Albania, with a smaller population and a completely different scenario when it came to people in arms, so no real civil war prior to the 997 Ponzi scheme debacle, we still managed to have between 2 and 9,000 people killed or disappearing for a population of roughly 3 point something million. Now, multiply that by 7 for the Syrian population, and you can go from 14 to, God forbid, almost 70,000 guys killed in 2 months purely on settlements. And of course, we have already SNA and the Kurds killing each other for fun. But imagine what can happen if this thing is not put down immediately. And that's what I said, that right now I do not see Giuliani being able to do anything about it. Because you need your troops to let go of whatever happened before. This means that the guy who killed your brother cannot live. If you know where he is, if you can put your hand on it, or his family, I know that you might think that I'm completely out of the loop, but no, it's and given some of the images we're seeing out of the prison system, the people who discover those and who were thinking about finding someone they knew or that was their dearby, these guys are nuts now. They're out for revenge. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. And on top of it, the government that is tentatively put in place rules on top of their shoulders. And the unification process that happened the last 2 and something years from Giuliani, it's just a unification. It's not an army. There are still many factions, and you can see that the way these guys are dressed. You got some people who look the part. They were Giuliani's army. Then you have other people who are reconciled rebels taking up arms and springing out of nowhere. So the complete patchwork of militias that makes the current rebel slash jihadi army is the main threat for Julan right now. And he cannot start and do what he did in Idlib back in the day, because this time he needs to rule most of Syria. On top of it, he cannot do much against the SNA because the Turks are there just for that. So there is nothing much to add. We should not expect any happy ending in the short term. And the only happy ending that might happen, as I said, is Israel goes too far. This enrages the civilian population. Julani has an egg on his face and he's literally powerless to do anything about it. And suddenly he needs someone to back him against Israel. And he's smart enough to see whatever attempt by the Americans to present themselves as some kind of arbiter between him and uh, the Israelis, literally saying, "Oh, you know, we're gonna amnesty you or let you rule Syria if you promise that to the Israelis." And I do not see the Israelis being completely fine by leaving Mount Hermon like right now, especially as the job against Hezbollah was half-assed and they had to make peace. But now with Syria gone, therefore Hezbollah having almost no means to resupply itself in short term, of course the Israelis might very well restart the war as they have Hezbollah and the Lebanese forces cornered. This, of course, will just send Israel in a tailspin with another 1,000 years grudge war against yet another group of Arabs. But at this point, the Israelis just don't give a fuck. They did probably the worst shit that have happened within this fucking planet since the Rwandan genocide. And the Americans literally voted by clapping both hands to give them money to do it. So I do not expect at all the Israelis to have anything to hear from the US unless, of course, Giuliani accepts to give another 2 to 5% of Syria's territory in exchange for being left alone. So, yeah, guys, there is not much to say there. The only thing we can hope when it comes to that is that the Russians either get to keep their bases long enough to evacuate most of their shit and leave that forsaken country on its own devices, or, as I said, the Russians playing it smart and finally still having some kind of place in post-war Syria for a few more years. But ultimately, it will still depend on how Giuliani is going to play his part. If Giuliani is stupid, as I think he is, because he latched upon taking out Assad and afterwards he had no control upon. So basically, what's going on with Israel right now, I do not think that Giuliani ever thought that the Israelis were going to absolutely obliterate whatever capacity Syria had and start to occupy Syrian territory. On the other side, let's say that he's smart enough to, as I said, consult with the Russians, with the Turks, and said, you know what, guys, please help me out with this shit. And I will not go to the Americans for that stuff. I will depend on you, on the Turks, on the Chinese, on whoever, but please make the Israelis stop. And he keeps his promise for a couple of months slash years. Then it's still not going to be a happy ending because then the Russians would have to switch horses, which actually it's already done because there is no other horse right now in Syria. Let's be honest about it. And this would mean the exact contrary to what a lot of pro-Ukrainians were happy about. But in my opinion, it would be also, in a certain sense, negative for the Russians because one of the things that I am dying to see is them disengaging as soon as possible from Syria, given that the structure they were supposed to protect in there and the population they were quote unquote supposed to protect in there literally shit on their faces. The Alawis and some of the Sunnis of the coast started to pull up the statues on their own. Nobody forced them. Of course, it was performative and an attempt to shield themselves from retaliation, but it doesn't work like that, guys. Like, and it was also, in my opinion, extremely stupid because they look even more cowardly than otherwise, and that, in my opinion, commands even less respect. I mean, you saw the video from the Russian servicemen literally insulting a lot of these guys that had dropped weapons that were heading for the Iraqi border. So, yeah, bleak. Silver line of hope, as I said, with Giuliani understanding that he has two gorillas on his ass right now, and one of those he cannot speak with because they're literally haram. They are Yahudi, and they don't give a fuck. They don't respect anything. I hope he had no deal with them because that would be funny. But on the other side, he would still be forced to deal with the Russians in such a sense that it will also pull the Iranians in and get him in the exact same position as Assad. But in this case, given his past as a former ISIS operative and former Al Qaeda, that would also paint a huge target up his face. And the Americans will not hesitate to take him out. So, right now, it's too early to call anything. The options I put on the table, there remain options. The only thing that's interesting for the Ziegler world here is the welfare of the Russian troops in there. I hope, as I said, that the Russians divest from the area. If they get to keep the two bases, okay, no biggie. But I would reduce them to the same level they were until 2013, which literally in Tartus there were 5 guys, and Hemim there was just one observer, and the base didn't exist before 2015. So, I mean, it was a Syrian Air Force base, but that's it. And I would like them to be able to bring most of their goodies back to Russia in order to, especially the air wing, help extend the bombing wing on the Kokols, because we are at the point right now where, and this is the second part of the deal, the Ukrainians are breaking and they are understanding where they're breaking. It's not the flood, it's not the HTS movement towards Damascus, but it's something that the Ukrainians are understanding. And if you have followed Timor Criminal, you know that we called it before everybody else, which is because of Kursk. Now, Monkey has absolutely no limit to the 4 oblasts that he has already claimed as annexed, which are, I'm going to repeat it, Kherson Oblast, Zaporozhye Oblast, Donetsk Oblast, Lugansk Oblast. All four are controlled at over 50%. The most problematic is Donetsk Oblast at around 65%. Lugansk is almost fully controlled, around 99%. Zaporozhye 73, 74. Kherson 73, 74. Now, as I said, Zaporozhye and Kherson are problematic in the sense that a huge chunk of Kherson, so basically what is not controlled right now, is beyond the Dnieper, and we've seen how difficult it is to actually cross the river without proper infrastructure. That is gone on that area. Kakovka Dam gone, Antonivka Dam gone, Antonivka Bridge gone, the Antonivka railway bridge gone as well. So basically, you will have to ford or force the river. Pontooning hasn't been going so well for the Russians or the Ukrainians, so for the moment that's not in discussion. Zaporozhye, as I said, half the city plus a small part of the oblast, I think about 9 to 10% is beyond the Dnieper as well. So therefore you have this issue that whatever you're going to claim over these two oblasts, physically you cannot access them, and even accessing them has a problem. I already explained which problem is if you are going to grab Kherson and Zaporozhye beyond the Dnieper, you are threatening, as I said, three different cities at once. First of all, Nikolaev, second city is Krivoy Rog, and by extension, on the map. So guys, I don't want to say some bullshit because sometimes I've mistaken. So you have Nikolaev, Krivoy Rog, and by extension you have Nikopol. If you have both of the country, both of the oblasts beyond that, there is a risk towards Dnipropetrovsk as well. But given the immediate threat to Dnipropetrovsk growing from the Russian bank of Dnipro, the problem of Dnipropetrovsk is something completely different and actually is way too far in the future as it stands right now, given the trend, given how the Ukrainians are defending themselves, and given the expenditure of equipment, assets, and human beings on both sides. So those two oblasts have a very specific problem for Ukrainians. I do not think that during negotiations they are going to be admitted as such, so fully given to the Russians if the Ukrainians are going to accept the Russian terms. And as I said, the biggest issue with Zaporozhye is that on top of the fact that it allows the Russians to be able to have a second crossing from Zaporozhye city towards the Ukrainian bank, let's call it like this, and therefore also continue towards Donetsk, the Ukrainians are never going to admit to actually give up Zaporozhye and Kherson as a stand. Of course, Kherson is a very specific problem for both sides. The Russians need Kherson absolutely because otherwise they cannot have water for Crimea. And for the Ukrainians, they cannot let Kherson go because having Kherson means that Zaporozhye at any single moment is under threat. Never matter if the Russians get Zaporozhye or don't get Zaporozhye. And having Zaporozhye also means that, as I said, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast is completely open with the correct tools and the correct approach from the Russian side. Now, for a long while, as I said, the Russians pushed towards Pokrovsk. In August, the idea was that they will probably go all the way in right away and threaten the city within September. I said quite the contrary. The Russians were never going to do that, and instead of having a rather stretched out bridgehead towards Pokrovsk, which could be more easily treated by the Ukrainians, they would, as I said, extend the advance towards Ugledar and try to make a juncture. So the front towards Pokrovsk would be a huge wall of roughly 60 kilometers, which would then facilitate the Russians' transit and transfer of troops through the E50 straight to the doorstep of Pokrovsk, completely bypassing the dangers of the small roads and trying to fight for every plot. This, as you can see currently, is the right approach. The Russians chose that, and in the process, within 3 months, gained another 1,500, 1,600 square kilometers, even more actually, based on deep state. And right now, if we want to fact check Narishkin's statement about Russia being closer to acquiring the targets, objectives of the SMO, I'd say that there is some truth into that, and the truth is pretty simple. The Russians right now are roughly at 11 kilometers from the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast borders. Given the area where they're going, it's pretty simple that there is nothing that's going to stop them bar a huge flux of equipment and manpower sped up to the border. If you have followed me and the usage I made of maps made by an Italian Osinter, Playfraz01, heads up to him. He's not a zero, but quality is quality. Then we can see exactly what we said about in September, October, and November is that the Russians right now, due to Kursk, have no mental impediment into going beyond that. And a lot of people have said this, people like Rogozin, us, other analysts, is that what happens with the Russians right now is that every time they are threatened by new weapons are pushed into the battlefield, they endure, they adapt, they suffer it, they go through it, and imposed as a punishment for this integration, as a punishment for the exceeding of that red line, more territorial grab. And in this case, the Kursk operation, coupled with the green light for Atakan, so long, quote unquote, range strikes within Russia proper, so not the new added territories, but the territories that were internationally recognized as Russia. Well, as I said, there has been a growth into the Ukrainian territorial losses, and also those losses have been extremely painful for Ukraine, because we're not speaking about, as I said, the Suja plain. We're not speaking about roughly 45,000 inhabitants worth of real estate. We are speaking about soon to be 500,000, a lot of urban centers, and with the fall of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, and possibly the Pokrovsk, Novoalexivka salient towards the Kharkov Oblast, you're going to have most of the metallurgical exploitation within that bank of the Dnieper. And then also there's a lot of chit chat about Shakhtarsk and the lithium deposit over there. That also plays a role, not as much for the deposit itself, but once again as an asset denial. As I said, Dashne has a metallurgical plant. Pokrovsk has the mines that are still used for metal production, iron production, steel production. And as I said, Shakhtar is going to have lithium. All these are not important for the worth and the exploitation. They are important for asset denial. So Ukraine doesn't have them. Not that Russia needs them, because if you open a map of Russia, when it comes to minerals and raw resources, you would ask yourself, why the fuck are these people even invading Ukraine? What Russia possesses, given its humongous size, dwarfs anything that Ukraine can pretend to exploit and market. Now, as I said, by having these moves, we are still in the punishing mode, but the more we advance and the more logically Russia advances within Ukrainian depth, we are seeing that we're getting beyond the punishment. Now we are going towards institution extinction. So Russia trying to get through the metallurgical sector of Ukraine would make Ukraine irrelevant for roughly 10% of its GDP. Russia taking out Motor Sich, Ivchenko progressed at a couple of strikes that happened in Zaporozhye recently. You're going to have another export potential that's gone from the Ukrainian portfolio. We are assisting here into a strategy that started in March 2022, was kept roughly until June 2022, then stopped. Then the Russians went for the energy sector, then stopped, then had to face off with the counteroffensive, which was stopped and reversed. The more we are going to these red lines, and the more the Western patrons of Ukraine are yapping about red lines, about how they humiliated Russia because they allowed Ukraine to use ATACMS, how they humiliated Russia because they allowed the use of storm shadows within its territory. Yappy, 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 yappy. At the end of the day, all they have to show for it, except from Russian damage, of course, is more losses for Ukraine, less tenable position for Ukraine. And we have now gone to a point where anything that Ukraine is doing is wrong. More recently, I think it was the Financial Times pointing out that the Russians were helped by the shit show that are Ukrainian trench works. They're not connected, they're ill-conceived. Meanwhile, we have retards as Dmitry and all these Ukro pushers that post videos on how the Russians are amazed by the Ukrainian Oporniks. Video was from November when they captured a previous stabilization point in a command post. But that's basically it. Everybody understands that Ukraine is late with its trench work. Ukraine is improvising a lot of shit. We had the discussion more recently about, it was in the Kursk period, about how Ukrainian earthwork, trenches, and everything that was shown so great was in fact extremely short-sighted, and that's what we had with the Ugledar push and Velika Novosilka push. The Russians completely bypassed the trench work that was done by the Ukrainians and now are attacking those trench works from behind, from the eastern side to Velika Novosilka, trying to go towards Andreevka, and then it's done. You have another gain of 400 or 500 square kilometers. I'm not saying that the Russians are going to do it before the end of the year, but there's still 20 days, and there is no answer on the Ukrainian side. So, what does this hide? Why are the Russians in such a hurry? What is the acceleration? All this stuff. A lot of people are speaking about a preparation for a ceasefire due to Trump making threats and using carrot and stick on both sides. I'm going to say once more, and I hope to be wrong, honestly, I do not think that Putin is going to heed anything that Trump's going to give him the few first weeks or months within this war. And I'm going to tell you why. Right now, one of the biggest disputes is on how Zelensky started to lie his ass off over the losses on the Ukrainian side. So one of the things he said is that they had lost 43,000 people killed and 370,000 wounded. This, of course, was in order not to contradict Trump when Trump said 600,000 Russians casualties and 400,000 casualties on the Ukrainian side. This, of course, could be very true in total. I'm speaking about the Ukrainian side. But we know for a fact that the number of killed that Zelensky presented as true is not. You know, you are losses, you know, lost armor. Both of them have gross 200 counts. UR losses probably should have updated by now because every beginning of month he updates. But he's already over 60,400 people, and lost armor is over 59,000. Every single one of these guys is named, and there is a source on how to find this obituary. On top of it, the Ukrainians themselves, I'm going to repeat myself, have already released data on the missing in action, or missing, because that's what they are calling them. They are missing in special circumstances during the war in Ukraine. Initially, they tried to hide the number by saying that they're both civilians and military. And so in February 2024, they penned a piece that about 50,000 guys were, 51,000 guys were, guys or girls, were missing under special circumstances, but that they had found 35% of those. And those were, once again, civilians or prisoners of war, which meant that the rest of it, massively, if not whole of them, being military, were roughly 33,000 by February 2024. Fast forward in April and May 2024, the numbers went back to 54,000. And the 35% that were found were not included anymore. There was a number given back then that 41,000 of these missing in action or missing under special circumstances were military. Then in June 2024, we went back from the 54,000 to 42,000, of which the majority was said back then were military. This yo-yo of numbers is actually very normal because meanwhile you had both people that were found because, well, they were separated by the war, but also people that were identified as killed. And this is one of the things that happened and expressed by the Ukrainians themselves. Meanwhile, we found about 7,000, 3,000 were POWs, 4,000 were killed in action identified. And we arrived with September 2024, where, as of the 26th of September, the Ukrainian side says that 55,000 are missing under special circumstances. Majority of them are military, and they have 2,410 bodies that are killed in action, but not identified. So the total of missing in action or not attributed to killed or missing or prisoners of war, in this case, if you want to put them together, you have roughly 57,210 people who are yet to be identified which status it is or to be given a name. This category of people, which is massively, once again, military, and I think they are all military because civilians at some point would have been found, or there are just not enough civilians to constitute 10,000 people getting killed. In none of the cities so far we've seen as many civilians as, for instance, in Mariupol, that were trapped there because the whole city was still in when the war caught up with them. So we have Zelensky saying 43,000 killed, but we have already 60,000 killed, 60,000 plus 57,000 that are obviously not there. And therefore we are at almost 120,000. Meanwhile, the Russians between the 18th of October and 27th of November dump another 1,565 or 66 bodies, of which 63 or 62 are from the crash from January 2024, which of course in this case are named because they were on the list of exchanges. But then you got another 1,500 people who are not named or should not be named, given that they are being given back to the Ukrainian side. And these people could not have been dead by 26th of September, given that before that the Russians had already given another batch of 250 and 250, 250. So when you put all this together, you can more or less see that half of the guys who are supposed to be killed are missing in action, and the Russians dump more bodies into the problem. But generally speaking, the killed in action, supposedly so, are almost 3 times what Zelensky is saying. So once you have this, and once you also start dealing with the away from location or deserters that are over 100,000 up to 200,000, as was spoken by Butuzov, you can understand that the losses of the Ukrainian army, just these, we're not speaking about wounded. The Economist had a number of 400,000 too wounded to continue fighting, so basically irrecoverables. Once you do all this together, you can just not believe anything that's going to come from Ukraine. I'm not saying that Russians do not lie. I'm saying that the Russians, unfortunately, do not go out there with Putin saying, we have lost 5,000 guys. Of course, Putin has said enough bullshit about we have struck this and that and we've destroyed 500 tanks. But that's exactly what the Ukrainian high command does every single day when they say they've killed, but not exactly killed, but still killed 2,000 people. So that's par for the course. But the problem for the Ukrainians is that we're supposed to believe as Westerners or living in the Western world that the Russians are lying. But at the same time, we have the Ukrainians, their leadership, lying straight up, not in a weird way, just lying. It's just straight up lie. We have only lost 43,000. We have 360 or 70,000 wounded. Bro, maybe you have 370,000 wounded. I don't give a fuck. But as sure as hell, you have 120,000 guys who are not breathing anymore. And that's what you say, not what the Russians say. And when I say they say, because the obituaries are not coming from the Russian side, those are obituaries from the Ukrainian side. So, self-admitted, killed or missing 120,000. If we have to base the same analysis that we do for Mediazona, where Mediazona says 50,000, 55% to maximum 55% of unknown losses, and you add that to the 66,000, then the killed in action, out of the 60,000, you are at 130,000. If you want to apply the exact same methodology that the guys at Mediazona and Medusa are doing for the Russian side. Plus those who are missing, if you want to add it on top of it, to make it absolutely untenable as proposal that Ukrainians have only lost 53,000. Well, don't forget, in January, he announced 31,000. That means that they've lost 1,000 people killed each and every month. As I said when I did that post a couple of days ago, the first step to losing at anything is lying to yourself. And that's what's happening right now. Ukrainians are lying to themselves publicly. Of course, in private, everybody knows what's going on. And we have videos on both sides on that the situation is not rosy, that people are forced to do a lot of shitty stuff to survive. There are people getting caught every day on both sides as prisoners of war. There are war crimes being committed on both sides in various forms. There was a video more recently of wounded Russians getting finished off by Ukrainian soldier while he was plundering their weaponry. Then he turns back and he fires some more into dead bodies. By the way, desecration, of course, is also a war crime for people who want another example of that. And at the same time, of course, the Russians are, especially in Kursk, have no issues lining Ukrainians up and making them a little bit colder by ventilating them all over their bodies. So on that aspect, the war is gaining in atrocity. And on that aspect, the whole PR game that Ukrainians played so well until 2023 and a half is now backfiring massively to them, because we are to a point where, as I said, they are completely in denial of their own reality. And that reality right now is that not only they're losing people and losing a lot of them, it's pretty simple. As I said, if you take out the guys from January 2024, it means that in 42 days they got 1,500 plus bodies back, and those are all the bodies that were left behind. Don't forget that Ukrainians still maintain this bullshit about how their medical evacuation teams are so good and they do all this shit so well that avoids unnecessary casualties. But if each and every month you have 500 guys that are lying on the fucking ground that you haven't picked up, these are not all the guys you've lost. A lot of the people you're losing are still behind the lines of contact. A lot of people you're losing are on the front line that you evacuate. The whole point of this war, given its attritional nature right now, is that you do not operate in a smooth way. So a lot of shit happens. More recent videos, especially by Wargonzo, sees guys moving on towards Shakhtarsk in the Pokrovsk area, and then on the side road you see Ukrainian camos lying there unpicked. Those guys are freshly killed, but the front towards Shakhtarsk, for instance, was still for 2 weeks. So either they got killed right now or they got killed 2 weeks ago. It doesn't matter, but they weren't picked up. Meanwhile, the front has moved, so other guys were killed beyond as well. This monologue is just to tell you guys that right now, this war is going to a way that Trump simply cannot control the way he thought he would. The Ukrainians need a completely different approach to this, and they are trying to pretend they're doing it. They're started right now with a shitty M2 mounted robot called TW, whatever they want to call that shit. And these guys going to be what, 5, 10, 20 per month? They cannot replace the 100 of guys you need to man your trenches, especially as on the other side, what has exploded literally, and we are hearing it from a lot of manufacturers on the Russian side. Given the success of the optical fiber attacks in Toretsk, Pokrovsk now, but especially in Kursk, where the Ukrainians literally recognize there is no answer to that shit because they do not emit radio frequencies, so you cannot know where it's coming from. Everything is insulated given the optical fiber length. And in a certain sense, the thing that for a long while I was discussing, that why the Russians do not have something like Spike or like Almas, well, finally I was literally beaten the fuck out by the fact that the Russians have exactly that, but with FPVs and at a fraction of a price and with good enough a warhead. The most recent casualty of the Vandal FPV was an Abrams. It took two, actually one to be honest, given how shitty the design of the Abrams is, but it took two FPVs and the Abrams was gone. And that's the beauty of this thing. Both sides have been going up into the chain of sophistication, but the thing that's making the difference between one side and the other is not the tools, is the operators, is the man behind it. And when we say man, that's manpower. And at this point, the biggest problem for the Ukrainians is that the trend for their manpower is simply on the way out. The fabled 155th Brigade that was trained in France, yada, 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 lost already its first guys, 6 guys, 3 were captured, I think, and 3 were killed. And you're going to say, oh, but 2,300 guys. Yeah, it starts like that. Let's say that you go like that for 10 days, it's 60 guys. Not counting the wounded, of course. The attrition rate on both sides, but on the Ukrainian side, is extremely high. And what they're seeming to lose, it's not terabobs like it was the case for a while right now. No, these are foreign trained guys that were supposed to come and give a boost, whip up the quality of troops on the Ukrainian side. We saw also a first generation Caesar being hit today, I think, by FPVs. It seems that the 155th is finally there, and it's not, as was said in one of the videos, to replenish troops. These guys are there to fight as a unit, but they already have a couple of illustrious losses. One being a Caesar, couple of MPVs, some POWs, some 200. This is where I wanted to tell you guys for a while that Trump is not going to be able to dictate that tempo unless something else happens. And that something else is, unfortunately, right now, and Zelensky himself is trying to nudge everybody into that direction, which is foreign troops in Ukrainian soil. And unfortunately for Zelensky right now, Europeans are not going to do it because they understand exactly what the problem is. The problem for Zelensky and the European partners, America is something different. For the European partners, is that what they can send right away would be maybe a bunch of 2,000 troops per nation. Let's say 5,000. And the 5 big guys are going to put together about 20,000 troops. Those 20,000 troops, if they don't fight, they're useless. Everybody says, yes, the French, Italian, Germans, and whatever are going to man the rear. Do you guys understand what manning the rear means? This is not guarding sensitive installations. The whole point is not to have those installations being visible, having guards, having sentinels and shit like that. What is thought and understood by manning the rear is literally doing the pre-mile logistics. So basically, this guy's going to start loading echelons and being visible on satellite by doing the shit that right now civilians on the Ukrainian side are doing. What do you think is going to happen? Let's say you got French troops in Numan charging ammunition for a Ukrainian train. Beneath is going to visit, and you're going to start having 5, 10, 20, 15, 50 French casualties. Then what? Is France going to invoke Article 5 by being in a place they're not supposed to be? The tripwire logic in this case plays against NATO. And that's why Americans do not want to talk about it. Sending secret squirrels, sending bullshitters over there, it's not a big issue. It doesn't really fucking matter. Sending a half-deaf former Marine get whacked in Bryansk, how the fuck cares? Getting a former Ranger getting schwacked at the same place, who cares? Best case scenario, Ukraine is gonna pay the bill for that. Yeah, no biggie. But having active duty soldiers going there, seeing them covered by cluster ammunition 200 kilometers beyond the front, because the Americans are not going to hide, and then being stuck with the hypothesis that you cannot retaliate to the Russians based on their own laws of war. The Americans doing that kind of job for the Ukrainians are opening themselves to attack. So once you're there, your whole point is moot. You will have to intervene militarily, not simply on a supportive role. But this is what they don't want to. Because then they open themselves to another type of problem, which is, and we've spoken about this, Ukraine is separated by a huge ass river. And we've seen that the Russians can absolutely blow any one of those bridges and cripple the dams. Especially the one the closest to the front line, given that now they have those motherfucking gliding bombs. So once again, whatever happens, if Monkey accepts a deal, this deal, it would be negative for the Western allies of Ukraine anyway. I cannot see Monkey accepting some kind of Minsk without any kind of legal referments, because of the fact that the whole war started because of Ukraine wouldn't abide by these half-assed deals. Russia neither, but Russia wasn't on the deal officially. So the process now for Trump is to make a choice. Either he goes full pressure on Russia, which would then on short to medium term result in more ground lost by Ukraine, and would be an exact mirror situation of what Trump decided to do in Afghanistan in 2017 and what he understood by 2019 that led to the Doha agreement with the Taliban. We hope it's not going to be like that, because it took a lot of bloodshed before Trump finally understood he was going nowhere. And in this case, we are not speaking about 5, 6, 700 people dead by drone strikes and about 1,000, 2,000 Afghani policemen killed by Taliban attacks. No, here we're going to be talking roughly about 50,000 extra killed per year as a minimum, and another 100,000 wounded and irrecoverables for the Ukrainians. So 150,000 Ukrainians out of combat. 1 year, maybe they can sustain that, because that's what they want to actually levy, 160,000. But a second and third year with their age pyramid, and don't you worry about how many Russians are going to die. As I said, on the manpower loss, one Ukrainian loss is about 3 to 5 Russians, depending how you want to count it. And this is exactly what happened with Kursk, which was siphoning troops from Donetsk. Kursk failed to function properly. They are now gnawing and holding as much as they can to the shitty land they have, but they've lost in return now 2,000 square kilometers. But most importantly, they've lost a fuck ton of bodies, both in Kursk and in Donetsk. So for Trump, honestly, if he wants to finish this war in any kind of advantage for Ukraine, he would have to decide on an intervention, be that some kind of peacekeeping force in the vein of the Russian paratroopers driving to Pristina airport, or decide to have a limited escalation with the Russian forces within Ukraine, but without any kind of warranty that the Russians are not going to escalate themselves. And unfortunately, although it was dramatized, the Oreshnik strike was dramatized and instrumentalized, who says that the Russians are not going to fucking Oreshnik the shit out of Kiev, but this time with nukes? If the Americans attack the Russians within Ukraine, it would be in direct line of the NPT agreement. A nuclear force attacks another nuclear force completely within Russian nuclear doctrine, and it would be a Hail Mary on Trump, believing that the Russians are going to back down. If Russians back down after an American attack, then the whole house of cards falls down, and the Americans can just keep pushing and liberate Ukraine for the Ukrainians. This leads to me to believe once again that Trump should better just shut the fuck up, let this play, keep sending the same kind of weaponry that Biden was sending, slowly cook the Ukrainians, and then he can jump in between and have his shitty peacemaking force coming into the Dnieper and then pretend that he saved Ukraine. Of course, during the negotiation phase, what's going to happen is that those troops are going to be replaced, probably by a third party, Indians, Chinese, who the fuck cares? But as sure as fuck, Trump doing that, jumping the gun like that, means pretty simply that Ukraine is losing the whole eastern bank. And we have indeed a Korean scenario with a huge problem, is that in Korea, both sides were rather underdeveloped. In Ukraine right now, losing the eastern bank of the Dnieper means you have zilch to redevelop yourself. You'll have to completely reinvest at least 1 or 2 trillion worth of dollars in order to bring back Ukraine to a normal level, but you will have a rump state with, of course, still a part of the coast, but still a rump state of, who knows, maybe 25 million people out of the 37 million when it started. There is no victory in that, guys. On the Ukrainian side, at least. For the Russians, it's a cynical asshole called Monkey that's dealing with it, so victory is what he decides. And it would be a victory. Pyrrhic one, incomplete one, you want to call it, but it will be a victory. It will be a W. But then we will have to think about how not to turn that incomplete W into what happened in Syria. And that's where we're going with the 2025 basic lines, which is Monkey should stride for Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In my opinion, they should simply stop caring about Kursk as it stands. Freeing it is, of course, an imperative. I'm not discussing this. But they should not care about Kursk as much as they should care about foreign Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. As I said, you got the ore basin there, you got multiple industries and industrial hubs there that you can take over. But also, as I said, once you get through and start building a wedge between Zaporozhye city and Dnipropetrovsk, then you are doing exactly what was supposed to be happening 2022. Only, of course, with ifs and with what was supposed to do. I mean, like, we can fill up books, but the reality is that as it stands right now, and given how the oblast is protected in Dnipropetrovsk, you got the chance to finally turn this war completely upside down and without even needing to attack Kharkov. As I said, once you have exploited southeast Dnipropetrovsk and trying to put this wedge between Zaporozhye and Dnipro, then once the Ukrainians are too busy dealing with that stuff and your shorter front line are helping you push the Ukrainians around Zapo towards the river, then you can, as I said, attack around Novoalexandrovka, and then threaten the Kharkov Oblast by the south, which was supposed to be the junction point with Barvinko in 2022, but never happened. And in 2025, given what we're hearing, what is going to be prepared, and given what the losses are on the Ukrainian and Russian side, especially the Ukrainian side, Ukrainians are not replacing anything right now. And we've already discussed about the motorization going on within the Ukrainian armed forces as a cheap expedient, but that is rendering their troops a lot less effective and depriving them of actual firepower. If you want to see how absurd that is the most recent counterattack around Bilogorovka, where the guys have just lost 3 Cossacks. And FPVs did the job. 6 FPVs, 3 vehicles. If those vehicles were, I don't know, Bradleys or Ts or BMPs, whatever, it would have taken 12 maybe. You're going to say it's still the same result. Yes, but the resiliency and the firepower would have changed a lot of things. We are going on both sides to the finish now, where the manpower and the type of units lineup is going to, the Orbat basically is going to cost one or the other side a lot more than it cost them initially. We can say, for instance, that the Orbat, being so trashy during the counter, forced them to make their attack around May, June anyway. Because on soft ground with the huge maps that they were trying to use in Zaporozhye, would have been some weird shit going on. But it's the same thing now. Using wheeled vehicles is going to force a lot of these people to go through the roads, or hardened roads, or frozen roads, whatever you want to call that. But that means less tactical mobility, less strategic mobility as well. Whereas a tank, due to the tracks, can do a bit more. That was the main complaint that Ukrainians had initially when the Russian counterattack started in Kursk. And we are going to go back to the same problems as usual. Ukrainians are going to resist enough. They're going to maybe get a shot in the arm with new people recruited or grabbed or bussified. And then after 2 to 3 months, out of, I don't know, the 60, 80,000 they're going to get to replenish them, 15 to 20,000 would be killed, wounded, or captured. And we go back to the same problem, that the staying power of the Ukrainian army is inferior to the staying power of the Russian army. Now, of course, people are going to say, at what cost? And I'm going to say, who the fuck cares? On that aspect, I think a lot of Russians should take a page from Giuliani. At what cost did Giuliani keep his power within Idlib? And how many guys he put into shitty Toyotas and sent them through the roads of Aleppo to finally completely blow up the system. And Ukraine is rotten, not in the same way as the Syrian Arab army. But where Ukraine is strong is to its internal control, but where it's weak is the means that it has at its disposal, of course, compared to what it has up front. And this is it. This is why the Ukrainians now are trying their best to not give up before what they see as the culmination of the Russian offensive in the Donbass area. And I think you were here, most of you, when I told you that Ukrainians are still counting on Russian offensive peaking in September 2024, and Toropetsk and all these bullshit attacks on Russian arsenals. Remember, everybody was clapping both hands, saying, "Oh my God, it's gonna be so much easier right now." Brothers, we are 3 months after it. Ain't nobody stopping the grape train. That's it. There is nothing else to say right now. Ukraine is not Syria, and Russia is not the SAA. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, they believed in their own con that they're fighting mindless orcs. This is childman level of thinking, and that dehumanization and that mocking is what is going to cause a lot more damage to the Ukrainian armed forces, especially at the moment where they're going to start cracking. As I said, whereas the Sunnis want to off a lot of Alawis for whatever reason, the Russians have now lists of people who participated in the horror show that Ukraine called its PR for now 3 years. As I said, it better not end by a capitulation, because otherwise a lot of Ukrainians that are having fun with drones right now, and a lot of people who took part in financing drones, producing drones and everything, are gonna get hanged to lampposts or shot in the street like dogs. I can promise you that drone operators right now are worth less than a used condom on the Ukrainian army if by any chance they end up in Russian hands. So that's, I think, one main take that Ukrainians need to think very, very carefully. It seems that it's to the finish. But once again, we've been here before. We thought that the Ukrainians were understanding that there was no positive ending, and they still kept fighting. Zelensky went with Kursk, made things even worse. He still now yaps about how he's going to liberate Crimea and this and that. And 2 or 3 weeks before, he said, "Oh, you know what? we cannot free everything by military force. We're going to try and do it by diplomatic force. And I'm like, to whom? And now 2 weeks and something after, we hear that, oh, you see, there is always a military option. And I'm like, well, what can I say? Crazy cokehead bitch. The more we advance in this war, and the more we are getting to the point where the lionizing of this guy and the whole Ukraine apparatus is literally lionizing a bunch of junkies high on their own alleged success. This is where it breaks down, guys, honestly. So, sorry for this lengthy interlude. I think I've said most of what I want to say. I think that the next space, hopefully, we will be between Shevchenko and Pokrovsk. People within the group know what I said about the situation. I also made a quick hint at what the Russians want to do with Dashne and the circumvallation of Pokrovsk. Russians are seemingly are doing what I would do, although, as I said, I have no formal military training above simple tasks and running a armored vehicle. But it seems to me that whoever is at least planning and following the task line in Pokrovsk and Ugledar is good enough. And I think if you pull out the FPVs from the equation of right now, the potential is for the Russians to advance minimum at 15, 20 kilometers per day. So the scare that the Ukrainian armed forces have behind Dachne and on the Dnipropetrovsk limit, I think it's extremely logical, and it is there that I hope that the Russians finally break through and can come with a clutch maneuver somewhere around March 2025. Not that they're going to reach Zaporozhye or Dnipropetrovsk Oblast in 4 days. This is not 2022. No, but they would at least be deep enough in a certain way, a bit like what happened with the few first days of Ugledar, when they got, I think, 60 square kilometers per day on that area alone, which was an absolute disaster for the Ukrainian forces. So, yeah. So, guys, whatever you want to add, now it's your time. Thank you for being here. And you got the floor, guys. Okay, apparently I think I put you all to sleep because there is no any kind of reaction. Then, well, if you are done, if you don't need to add anything more or less, we are gonna add just 2 extra spicy points. I wanted to give them a bit later, but as I already said, on Kursk area alone, we are, due to the optical fiber attacks, at 90% of hits and over 80% of destruction from hits. And then another thing is that a friend of mine who has access to real satellite data, has pointed out that all over the Postmatat, I'm gonna give you the word, don't you worry. All over the Pokrovsk South Donetsk axis, there have never been more than 700 tanks at any given moment. That means that the Russians have pulled at least 240 to 300 something tanks all over the year 2024. And this is a recovery rate, worst case scenario, about 20%, and best case scenario, 35%. This explains a lot of patchwork that we see on a couple of new tanks, but also why the Russians are not running out of vehicles. It's very possible that similar numbers are working for other vehicles, although due to the construction of BMPs, for instance, it's a lot less doable to recover them, especially after heat damage when they burn out. Do not explode, but they burn out. Yep, those were the two small IDs, just to give you a little bit more. And now it's going to be the turn of my friend. Go on, bro. It's up to you. Postma, it's up to you, man. You can intervene. I think you have the floor.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, okay. I'll be pretty brief. I just wanted to ask, are there like any correlations between like the drop of Lancet use, as in the drop of videos that we are receiving? At least if you look at Lost Armor in the past few months, there's been a noticeable decrease. And is it correlated anyway to like a pretty big increase in Shahed attacks? Like I obviously know that dome production doesn't work like in a video game. You know, you decrease Lancet and you increase Shahed, but like there's essentially a correlation there where the Lancet use dropped, but there's a pretty big increase in Shahed attacks. So I'm just interested if those two are correlated, and what is the reason for the drop in Lancet use? Thank you.
Well, for Lancet, I'm going to tell you as I think it right away. I do not think it is a drop in use of Lancets. I am more or less scared that it's something completely different. We spoke about it for a while with my Albanian friend General, that we gave Lancet about 3 to 6 months, about a year ago, due to the fact mostly that the Lancet would be damaged by the fact that the product has been staying the same more or less with some refinement until very late in 2024, around July, August, and September. From there on, if you guys remember, there is this campaign from the Ukrainian side to start hunting the correction drones, so the lightweight ISR. That thing, for a long while, pissed me off because I thought maybe they were right. But actually, that's not the case. One of the latest Lancet attacks that I saw had an attempt to intercept the Lancet by a FPV live, but the Lancet still went through. On the other side, Lancet interceptions by those interceptor FPVs are literally the lowest category. Zalas are being hunted because they fly rather low. Orlans are being hunted. But if you saw the videos more recently, there is also a drop into them, and this is due to the fact that the Russians are using counter measures to that. However, what the problem is with the Lancets, this is one of the biggest troubles I'm finding, is that more recently the attacks were rather mid-range. I don't know if you guys remember, but Lancets, for instance, in Kursk, were used abundantly during the month of August, and they also helped stop a lot of the attacks along with the new OptiFiber drones. However, for Kursk, for instance, at that point, something else has also disappeared. For a couple of weeks, Orions were there, Inokodes were there almost every single day. We had 1 or 2 strikes. Orions are gone. the Lancets are also gone, and one of the things that people are implying right now is that the Lancets never fared very good during the winter. If you want to, if you don't want to believe me, actually, you're gonna check the data for winter 2022 and winter 2023. Still, you would have more Lancet than what we're seeing. So, in my opinion, what's going on right now is that finally the Lancets are being more smartly interdicted, not in the sense that there is a spoofing of the system, because the Lancet, thank God, has an auto tracking device, so it can plunge to the attack mode even if it's not 100% successful. But most of the points that I want to say is that the Lancet still seem to be a prevailing case. Why I'm saying this? Mostly because still between 15 and 25 kilometers, most of the artillery pieces that we're seeing hit, even by FPVs, the most recent was in Pokrovsk, a first generation Caesar on a Sherpa truck. Everybody is having Lancet cope cages. So what we are seeing most probably is some kind of OPSEC on the Russian side because of two things. We're seeing destruction of material. Not every material that we're seeing destroyed on the ground given by self-help posts from the Ukrainian side, but also by attack posts from the Russian side, is corroborated by the losses on the ground. One of those things is that, for instance, when the Kursk lists were being made, a lot of the losses that you would see, I think about 4 or 5 VABs, 2, 3 FV432s were destroyed or were found destroyed, but we never saw what hit them. More recently, we are seeing that the Russians are showing more and more optic fiber, and they are showing more and more destruction on real time. However, I'm going to repeat once again, the problem is that FPVs still dominate and destruction is still there. So, is there a correlation with the hunting of the ISR, low-level ISR drones? Probably that there is some. But that would also mean a correlation with the destruction of Lancets, because as you know, you fly one Zala and you fly a couple of Lancets to have the whole hunter-killer mode. But we are seeing a fuck ton of Zalas, but almost nothing on Lancets. On the other side, the same Ukrainians now are pretending that fabs are going down, and instead of having, I don't know, 100 fabs that they said before, now we have maybe 20 or 30. This once again is not corroborated by the serial numbers that we're seeing there. We do not have more shot down planes. So on that aspect, again, what we seem to be seeing is a probable adversarial effect. So Ukrainians have found a way to avoid as many attacks as before. This could be, as I said, the ISR attack. But at the same time, there does not seem to be a relief on the Ukrainian side when it comes to protection from Lancets. You're going to say, yeah, but those protections work also with drones. I completely agree with you, but no Russian drone has gone so far as 30 kilometers away, so it makes no sense. This could also be explained by the fact that Lancets for a lot of time were used against artillery positions. And it could be also possible that finally the Ukrainians have received enough propellant so they're not forced to fire between 6 and 14 kilometers of range, which would make them extremely visible both for Lancets and for FPVs. But once again, I cannot explain fully by saying that it is this, or that. If it was a interdiction of the ISR, there would be an interdiction of the means as well, because as I said, they're both flying at the same time. If there was a electronic warfare interdiction, it also doesn't matter because the Lancet cannot be interdicted under 300 meters. But most of the time, the Lancet is flying over 1.2 kilometers to detect the threat. And once it has detected, it will go there, even if the man in the loop loses the video feed. And also the fact that they are now moving from there are less Lancets and there are also less cabs. It seems to me that there is a problem not as much with the strikes on that side, but there is a problem more about what Ukrainians want to tell, and which is being also helped out by the fact that the Russians, for whatever reason, are not showing as much. However, whereas I'm having a problem is that if the Lancets were going down, but the advance of the Russian forces was being curtailed, then I would say to you, this is clearly adversarial. There is a lower capability on the Russian side. They are not advancing. However, we have a completely different approach right now. The advances are being sustained, and we're still at the peak of advances. A lot of people were trying to say that, oh, Pokrovsk has stalled, and they were pointing out to the fact that there was barely 2 to 3 kilometers per day for about 3-4 days. And then, boom, suddenly Pokrovsk gains 40 square kilometers out of nothing. Is that happening in one day? No. And this is why I would like to say that right now, for the moment, we have less videos, but I would literally wait until we get beyond the year 2025 and then pay attention to what happens. One possibility when it comes to the Lancet itself is that the Lancet is being changed. And finally, we might have those swastika Lancets that we were hoping to have since 2023, actually. If it is the case, I'm not saying it is the case, if it is the case, then unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they are going to have to fight against the current for the rest of their lives. On the other side, we have the same drought on the Switchblade 600. They have received over 665 Switchblades, according to the Kiel Institute, the 600 variants, the big ones. And we have seen roughly about 15 strikes over 6 months. Is it because those don't work? I do not think so. I really think that the footage is being hoarded in a way or another, and maybe it is also a sign of failure, more frequent failure on both sides. But in any case, I would still wait until next year to see if the trend is exactly what we think, or we're going to have what we had last year in 2023, 2024, when suddenly the Russians dumped a megaton of Lancets out of nowhere. The same thing happened also in 2022, 2023, especially the year around Bahmut, when in February 2023 we had also a mega dump of Lancet strikes, including 2 Vilkas, a couple of crabs. Remember the very beautiful crab explosion. So, do I have a definitive explanation? Absolutely not. It could be interdiction. It could be a markup to another system. It could be a way to proof those Lancets, like it's happening with a lot of the ISR items, which now have electronic warfare installed to them, feed hijacking, feed blurring against those FPVs that come after them. But at the same time, as I said, we do not see enough Lancets being intercepted to go anywhere close to, okay, the Lancets are being hunted down, so that's the problem. As I said, in total, if you check everywhere over Telegram or over X, Twitter, you're going to say maybe 15 Lancets, I think 9 to 10, but 15 Lancets being attempted to be shot down or destroyed. There were, in my opinion, more Lancets being hit by machine gun fire on the ground or thwarted by chicken wire than the whole interception method is doing it right now. I hope this is enough. If you have another question, okay. Otherwise, it's going to be per body.
No. Thank you for the answer.
No problem, man. You're welcome.
Right. I wanted to ask you about the fall of Syria and the consequences for Russian arms sales in Africa and Middle East and Northern Africa. Because as far as I'm concerned, Ukraine is, of course, about Ukraine, but also about the Black Sea and Mediterranean, and with Syria gone and Libya being what Libya is, it all goes out of the window. And especially for countries like Algiers or maybe Egypt, if they wanted to maybe pivot towards Russia, and maybe Mali, Nigeria, and so on, so on, it makes things all that much harder. So that's for me.
Oh, well, if it's just over the overflights, then for at least 6 to 12 months, there is nothing to be scared of as it stands right now. For one main reason, the air defense area, especially the one that goes from the Iraqi side towards the Mediterranean seas, has been handed back to quote unquote Turkey. Turkey has had no problem with letting the Russians go towards Africa. There is a deconfliction mode. It's fine. As I said, Israel has never had any kind of problems for as long as it was the Mediterranean Sea route that was used instead of overflying Israel. And as for the rest of it, Jordan, of course, has never let Russians go through without actually previous notice, but most of the planes that are crossing over there are quote unquote civilian cargos, so no military cargos. In general, what Syria offered was a sea route. So basically, going out of the Black Sea before the war was always at the mercy of the Turks. The Turks would stop your cargo, and if there was shit there that didn't want to let you through, they would inspect you and let you go. Your biggest problem right now is not that much Syria, it's the fact that Ukraine is using unmanned boats to literally attempt at a blockade on the Black Sea. Of course, when it comes to semi-civilian ships and civilian ships, civilian cargoes, Ukraine is not risking it for the moment, although they tried a couple of times, because unrestricted naval warfare would be replied with unrestricted warfare at all. And the Ukrainians already had a taste of that during a couple of weeks in October 2024, and they were extremely unhappy about that, especially given that the premium to actual dock in Ukraine went up like crazy, and no boats would risk the adventure. Then, of course, the Russians simmer down and the traffic goes on. So, on that aspect, the biggest problem is not as much the overflight. Overflying Syria, Syrians right now, or at least the power at B in Syria, has nothing to shoot down Russian airliners over 6,000 meters of altitude. And those assets that could be done, we saw the SDF picking up books. No, it was coups, sorry, 4 coup tels. Those guys, before they are able to use them properly, well, good luck. Of course, that is always a problem, because as we saw, using Soviet air defenses doesn't seem to be as complicated. 298 passengers on the MH17 can tell you that, and then also the Ukrainian guys who got shot by a Tor over Tehran can tell you the same thing. The problem, however, in my opinion, is that what do you do next? Because when it comes to purely the air transport, you have a couple of choices, and then those planes fly long enough, you don't need the pied-à-terre. It is easier to drop in Himim, grab stuff or depot stuff and go out, for sure. But at the other side, there is always a possibility to fly through Iraq. The Iraqis would not decline that possibility, especially because it would not pose a problem for the American forces. And if Trump actually does what he promised, which is pull out the troops from both northern Syria and Iraq. From northern Syria, I really doubt it's going to do that, especially what the Turks are doing to the Kurds. But if those people go out of Iraq, then the Russian might have a possibility, although this is completely hypothetical. Where things are brighter is that if the Port Sudan base is kept properly, so if that thing develops and goes on, then you don't really need Syria. And it's also easier because it's in between two passages, which is you can pass through Iran, drop your shit, take a boat from Iran, go to Port Sudan, and deserve the rest of Africa. Syria was nice, but Syria has a huge problem right now that's not going to be solved before the end of the Ukrainian war, or if the Russians find a solution to the unmanned boat problem. And therefore, as I said, Syria, as it stands right now, is a dead end. If you are looking to the airlift capability, Syria, as it stands, doesn't pose a problem. If you want to overfly it, if you want to drop to Syria, it will depend on HTS. If you don't want to drop to Syria, then you can overfly it towards Port Sudan, and then you have pretty much everything you want. You can link up with Egypt, you can link up with Iran, you can go straight from Port Sudan, cut through Sudan, and go towards where you want, be that by helicopter, by plane, by whatever stuff. However, what is true is that you cannot start distributing stuff as before. Without Syria, you don't have the same distribution power. In Syria, you had a port, two ports actually, Latakia and Tartus, and you had Hemim. Plus the other discharge bases. There were some Russian planes in Medze. You had the T4 that was more an operational base, but it was always useful. You had Homs, Hama, whatever. But generally speaking, Syria was a Syria operation first and foremost. The ports, that's an issue. And the ports are a double issue because going to Tartus right now will have to happen from Kaliningrad or will have to happen from Arkhangelsk, but the passage from the Black Sea will always be contested by the Ukrainian drones. And on the other side, don't forget that Ukrainians do not fucking care where they're operating, because one of the attacks was just outside the Bosphorus, still within Turkish territorial waters, and the Turks said simply nothing. Probably there would have been a stern declaration behind closed doors, but that's the problem with the Ukrainians, the way they're waging war in the Black Sea. They do not have much to lose, and they're using suicide boats. The price to pay for them, as I said, would be if that Russia decides they don't want to use the Black Sea at all anymore and start literally starving the Ukrainians by destroying every kind of cargo that goes in and docks into Ukraine. That, unfortunately, would be, as I said, unrestricted naval warfare. And never mind what Ukrainian forces do, the Western quote-unquote partners are not going to start admonishing them. They would even say that it's completely normal for the Ukrainians to use unrestricted naval warfare, given they are defending against an aggressor. This hypocritical stance is the problem within this war, and it's also a sign not of the Russian impotence, but simply the insurgency style warfare that the Russians are forced to deal with in the Black Sea. There is nothing to hit on the Ukrainian side. Yeah, you're maybe gonna find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 workshops from these drones, but they can literally build them out of sticks and stones. And nobody's putting any kind of limit on what Ukrainians can field from civilian products, whereas the Russians, God forbid, they're using literally dishwasher chips, because then the dishwasher brand gets sanctioned. So that's unfortunately the political reverse of the military coin within the Russian-Ukrainian war, and this is something that needs to change. But the only way it will change is if the Russians, as I said, score an important victory, and I think Pokrovsk and Mirnograd will be such a victory, which would push the allies, in my opinion, to start pressing the Ukrainians to think about, oh, bro, you're not winning this war. Maybe it's not what you want to do, so basically give up. But you need to make peace because at the end, we will need to fight the Russians. And this is one of the things that people keep talking about how if you don't defeat Russia and Ukraine, you're going to have to fight them tomorrow in Europe. The point is that we're getting to that red line where Ukraine is not going to be able to flex the trend of this war enough in the quote-unquote right side to avoid difficult choices for its partners. As I said, if Pokrovsk and Minograd are taken and the Russians then develop the offensive, as I said, in those two axes, one towards Dnipro, the other towards Kharkov, then you have a huge problem because the core issue of the war, which was taking Donbass, is going to be solved very quickly. Given the threat on Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and as I said, the potential wedge between Zapo and Dnipropetrovsk, while the Russians are also progressing towards the sister cities, Ukrainians will have to make a choice. We give up, and then the Russians pull back from Dnipro, and we give them the four oblasts, or we keep fighting with the risk then of not only losing the four oblasts, but also losing probably one of the most important, if not the most important, oblast as it stands right now. Both as a glass sea towards Russian deeper penetration within the eastern bank of the Dnieper, but also, strategically speaking, if Dnipro falls, then you're going to have two dams falling at the same time, Kamyanske and the one at Zaporozhye. And once you're going to lose those two hydros, you're also losing two passages towards the western bank, the Ukrainian bank. And then you're fucked. If you're Ukraine, now you need to defend not one crossing as before with the Antonovsky Bridge and Kakovka, of course. You need to defend 6 crossings, 2 dams, 4 bridges. And once the Russians are on your back from Nikopol and they start spreading going to the Kryvyi Rog, then you have a problem what you're going to do from Nikolaev. And then the whole point of discussing what's going to happen post, negotiations about the Ukraine bank Kherson, then it's moot. The Russians are already on the other bank. And then you are going to do exactly the thing you didn't want to do. That's what the Kherson operation happened in 2022. It was a danger for 3 different cities, as I said right now, Zapo, Kryvyi Rog, and Nikolaev. But if the Russians are back there, now you need to do 2 different counteroffensive. Again, push back the Russians, but now they have 3 passages, 4 passages by bridge and 2 other passages by dams. And now they have 2 more cities, Zapo and Dnipro. So the thing with Ukrainians right now, as I said, is that they understand, those who are smart enough, they understand where the fucking problem is. They understand what they need to do. But that would require absolutely an intervention. And when Narishkin said, as I said again, that we are close to securing our goals, there is a sliver of truth in there. And I think Russians know where the Ukrainians are manpower-wise, and also know that Ukrainians know where the Russians want to go. Sorry, it was a bit longish, but that's what I think.
All right. Can I get one last question? A short one.
Yeah, no problem.
All
Chill
right.
alone now.
All right. About Oreshnik in Belarus, because do you think this completely if it's not fake, if it's not a bluff, does it completely change the security architecture of Poland, Baltic states, and so on? Because the non-nuclear first strike capacity that's supposedly Oreshnik in Belarus gives, and in Kaliningrad, of course, completely changes the game in terms of NATO bases, particularly the two large ones in Poland. And I think it's another step on the ladder of escalation that could prevent and is very viable threat for NATO intervention, even in limited capacity. That's it.
Well, the problem is for Oreshnik in Belarus. First of all, I think it's a bit of a provocation, in the sense that the Russians want absolutely to show that they mean business. That, given that the Germans are gonna quote unquote escalate by having medium range missiles within 2026. This is quote unquote the reply. But on the other side, I think it's a bit of a bluff, because Oreshnik doesn't need to be in Belarus. It can, if you put that system anywhere in Bryansk, the delay from putting it to Belarus into Bryansk is going to be maybe what, 12, 15 seconds to reach the points it needs to reach in Poland. Okay, maybe let's add a full minute. I know that people are gonna say, "Yeah, but a full minute allows for." It doesn't really matter. On top of it, by having it in Bryansk, it's farther from any kind of preventative or preemptive strike, depending on the ones that NATO would like to use. However, if we take it as being true, the problem is that the whole NATO is going to escalate because you put Oreshnik there. Proves once again how myopic both sides are showing themselves. Although Russia now has it on the plate and knows exactly what the other side wants to do, because they are literally doing it in Ukraine. So for me, the logic, I do not see is any more escalatory, as I said, what Germans already have done, which is having American missiles again in Europe. And the fact that the Poles want the same thing. Russia, as it stands, hasn't quote unquote done anything wrong or anything inflammatory comparatively to what the Germans, NATO has already done. Now, we can always discuss about, former systems like the 7N928 and all this bullshit. But generally speaking, we are just playing a cat of mouse, game of cat and mouse between deaf and blind. One side says something, the other side ups the ante by pretending that it is the threatened side. But generally speaking, if I have to be honest with you, I think the moment the Russians show the Oreshnik, to me it's already game over, because suddenly the Russians go back exactly to the point they were 40 years ago, when they thought that the only way for them to preempt a full escalatory logic, the way the Americans wanted to do it with the Pershings, was to have the same kind of systems. And to stop that before most of its bases were turned into atomic ash, the Americans decided, by speaking to the Russians, to the Soviets, for a long while, not to do it. And we had the INF. But the point is that, generally speaking, that the Belarus has or doesn't have the Oreshnik, to the core of the system itself, changed nothing. If the Oreshnik is, as we think, 1,000 to 5,000 kilometers, some kind of capped Rubege, Pioneer, whatever you want to call it, it will not matter. The maximum distance between anywhere in Western Russia to anywhere that counts in Europe is within 2,000 kilometers. Is the extra minute going to change that much? I do not think so. Especially as we saw, the Oreshnik seems absolutely fearsome, and it hit a place that was supposedly defended by Patriot, at least a PAC-3 MSE. Of course, people are going to complain that, oh, the PAC-3 MSE is not there to intercept mere bullshit. But I mean, these are the guys who pretended that both Zircon was intercepted, Kinjal was intercepted, and Iskander is routinely intercepted like it's nothing. So where's the problem? You already have a defensive system, no? But generally speaking, yes, I think it's escalatory when it comes to the rhetoric. But in reality, both sides are doing it. So I would not give the NATO the benefit of the doubt when it comes to the intervention itself. They already made the steps. Poland, Romania, Germany. I'm sorry, guys, you don't get to bluff your way out of this. And if you're gonna get charged with Oreshnik nuclear tipped one, you know, there was a deal to be had in 2007. NATO refused to heed those calls. Tough titties for everyone. So, guys, I don't know if anyone else wants to intervene. If not, thank you very much for being present. Have a nice day, and hopefully, at least Syria dies down with some dignity and things turn not too bad for everyone involved. I'm speaking about the Russian contingent and some of the Iranian militias that might still be cut off. And for the rest, well, it's their country. They made their bed. If you go to bed with dogs and you wake up with fleas, it is what it is. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. See you next time.